Before we move to the panel, as you start to think of the questions, and I've got a few on here, but I need a few more, and I've got a few of my own personal ones I'd like to ask. I'm minded of the fact that Liddell Hart, a famous military historian, once said, the only thing more difficult than getting new ideas into the military mind is getting the old ideas out. And I think that applies to all organizations, actually, big and small. And I think what we've seen this afternoon is the ability or an initiative to try and get some of the old ideas out and to try and start some new ideas on regulation. And that's extremely exciting from my perspective. So thank you very much, team. But we'll come back to that if we may. And yes, could I just welcome Gwilym Stone, who has come in from the MCA to just perhaps comment on some of this and take some of the questions. But before we start, Gwilym, would you like to just explain your role in the regulatory side?
Yes, thank you. So within the MCA, I head up the regulatory policy teams. So those teams deal with the standards for the safety and environmental performance of vessels, navigation and communication, seafarer training, well-being, and health standards. So that whole gamut of regulatory issues, we deliver that alongside colleagues in the Department for Transport, but really sort of adding in the technical detail to the kind of high-level policy DFT sets for us.
And could I put you on the spot straight away and say, how does the work that we've seen here, how do you anticipate that dovetailing into the MCA?
So these issues are all very much on our agenda and some of the real areas of focus. The challenge of providing suitable regulations for what are emerging technologies is a big one, and the pace of change is something that is really stretching us, as I think it's stretching everyone in the sector to get their heads around it and get ready for it. But yeah, we're definitely prioritising that within our work.
Thank you. And if I may now, let me just work out where my first question comes from. Parag, can you take it, in fact, both of you, Parag and Andre, could you just explain, I'll perhaps start with you, Parag, how what you're doing and what we've seen here is you anticipate that migrating into the MCA work or the MTA regulations, and where do you go next? You've got some good ideas, you've got some plans, but where do you take them and how do you get it across the line?
Yeah, so the RHC it's an independent advisory body, and like I said, set up by BEIS and now sitting within owned by DCIT to some extent. What we do is we submit our report into government, and what will happen, we're aiming to do that in April, essentially. And what will happen is then we have a minister, very likely that minister in DCIT will write to the appropriate minister in Department for Transport, say, could you please organise then the government response to the recommendations in this report? I think there's a period of time, about 3 months, if I'm correct, where the government's required then both to publish the report itself online and make it available publicly, and the response to it. What we've seen in the past, we've seen, for example, I worked a lot on the fusion energy report. What happened was, at that time, BEIS published a response saying, yes, the recommendation was interesting, and they actually took that forward into a formal consultation. And that was actually quite pleasing to see. That's a positive response, I mean, from our perspective, in that those recommendations were taken seriously enough for BEIS to then propose that in a consultation, which they then did a formal response after the end of the consultation. So we do, if you like, can convene some thinking in government to move things forward. And we are independent as well, so we don't, we're an advisory body and independent, so it doesn't mean that anything we say actually will happen. I mean, that's true, right?
I'm going to play question time presenter slightly now and say, who's your minister?
That's really good, because I haven't kept up with the current changes, I must admit.
But no, which department in particular?
We're DCIT now, Department of Science.
Okay, so we are in the right area. Okay, thank you. And now, if I may, Andre.
I'm not going to answer that last question, because I do actually have been told, and I've forgotten the name because it was an email. So I've been a bit busy, I've been on the road. But to come back to the meat of the question, firstly, with the MCA, we work very closely with them on this, on the development of MAT. It's not being done separately as a, oh, look, here's something we're doing. It's very much integrated and, if you like, key stakeholder is a good phrase to use there. Secondly, MAT is about generating evidence. And one of the challenges with any new technologies is you tend to get companies who are ahead of the game, often have a lot of funding, and they'll drive things like standards and stuff like that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's always the right way to do it. And what we're trying to do here with the MAT program is create a body of evidence which enables the right development standards, enables the regulators to say, right, we can make these changes with confidence because we're backed up by properly qualified evidence and we can understand it. It's also something industry buys into. So it looks in different directions to work with the different stakeholder groups to make sure they're all on board. There's another key point here, is there's two entities who sit on the IMO for autonomy, and one of them is the MCA, and the other one is Lloyd's Register, who support them. And they're Lloyd's Register are very heavily integrated into MAT. They're one of really sort of the leading partner on this. So I hope that answers some of the question, but it's a work in progress, and the whole point is it's a constant discussion and discourse around that.
And, sorry, Gwilym, then I'll come to you guys later on, but there are technologies that have actually gone through the system, this is so radical that this needs radical thinking. But there are some technologies like composites and things which haven't quite had that radical thinking. Can you apply some of this radical thinking to things like composites? Or is that a plan, or are we comfortable with where we are at the moment?
I think there is the potential for exploring how new approaches to the way we deliver our regulations can be applied in a wider stream. I think one of the challenges for the sector is there's kind of a choice of, at the moment, most of our maritime regulation is pretty prescriptive, and there's lots of advantages to that in terms of clarity, in terms of consistency, but there are barriers when you want to do something new or novel. But actually, whether a move away from prescription more generally to more goal-based, more risk assessment is something the sector actually wants to see. And for some people and for some actors within the sector, it would be brilliant to get away from prescription. For others, I think it would become a real burden because actually compliance with prescription, if you can tick the boxes, ticking the boxes is an easy way to certification and compliance. So it is something we need to keep exploring and be open to.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks, Rob. I also chair the MASREG Working Group Regulatory Subgroup, and in the SMI MAS Council, or MAS Group, also attempt to get after the regulatory problem. And I have some sympathy, a huge amount of sympathy for the MCA, because they're being asked to do an awful lot very quickly with not many people, and everybody's demanding and beating them around the head with, let's do it quicker. So I think you've got a very good Maritime Guidance Note 664 about novel technologies, about moving towards a risk assessment-based approach to certifying novel technologies, and also the Workboat Code Edition 3 Annex Bravo is an attempt at codifying MAS. I think it goes back to the C word, which I mentioned before. It's not good enough just to issue regulation without talking to the manufacturers, and equally it's not good enough for manufacturers to say, well, I'm not getting involved, you didn't talk to me. It's got to be a discussion, it's got to be agile. And I think there's been some excellent feedback on the Annex Bravo, but my personal view, and I know SMI have got a view as well, and I know MASREG Working Group has, it's got to go back out for another circulation because we've got to iterate this and we've got to do it quickly. And there's a real opportunity to accelerate regulation, but we've all got to lean in. It's not just pointing the finger at MCA, we've all got a responsibility in this.
And BMT is obviously a design house as well. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about the idea of embedding regulators within your own organisation, seconding them so that actually when you do the design, it actually works with the regulator? I think that's something the nuclear world do. Perhaps you could talk a bit about that and whether that speed up the process.
That's probably easier for me to talk about. Am I coming out of this? Yes,
yeah,
right, there we are, good. So BMT, we work very closely with both the Defence Maritime Regulator and the Naval Authority. So we have people embedded in those organisations, and we're providing industry support to them as well. So our understanding of where the regulator is, the way we fit into that, is quite tightly woven into the fabric of defence certification. one of the things I'd point out, pick up on what Ben's just said actually, is regulators don't sit around trying to think of what to regulate next. They generally have overfull inboxes and they're just trying to cope with what they're regulating now. So at the point you think up a great idea, like autonomy, which is a great idea, and you go through the what ifs, at some point a regulator is clearly going to be interested in that as an idea. So the smart thing to do is go and talk to the regulator really early on about what that's going to look like. And the answer is likely to be, I don't know, which is great for you because you can then go along to the regulator and say, I think it could look like this. And you can work out an approach together. And certainly within the defence regulation world, and I'm sure that Future Technologies team in the MCA will be the same, we're very open to that because it solves a problem for them. And actually, all you want to know as a regulator is what's the credible body of evidence that I need to see to say yes to this. The problem you often end up with is like a dog trying to go through a gate with a stick that's too wide and it just keeps going round. Where someone's had a great idea, they developed it, they can't explain to you what it does or how, but they still want to go away and use it in an area where it creates a third-party risk. So that obligation to regulate quickly goes two ways. In the project teams who are developing things, you need to understand the regulatory environment and how you fit into it. And as regulators, you need to be open to new ideas and willing to look at blank sheets of paper and fill them in. And the mind-hunting capability team in Mod have done a really good job of that. Yeah, they've worked very closely with their regulator from quite an early stage, and that's put the whole project in quite a good place in terms of moving smoothly into IMO level 3 operations, so remote controlled unmanned, in a certified way.
Thank you. The next one is way outside my comfort zone, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. This is from Keir Gravel. Methocyclohexane, MCH, has been touted as a potential hydrogen vector in a number of studies elsewhere in the world. Has the RHC, someone's just moved, oh thank you, has the RHC considered this alongside pure hydrogen, ammonia and methanol? There you go. Hope you're up to that.
Can you repeat the question? I won't do that. So definitely the chemistry is outside my comfort zone too. But I think that, so there are several aspects to that. One, so we are, the scope or the remit was hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels initially, and we thought, so ammonia is in play there as well. I think what's interesting about hydrogen was, if you're long-distance shipping, international shipping, it looks like liquid fuels definitely have more of a role to play, potentially ammonia, potentially methanol, potentially other liquid carried fuels. But, and there, the IMO has a role to play, and that's a different regulatory challenge, if you like, to what can we challenge in UK territorial waters. So that's one reason why we decided, okay, let's see what we can do. If we're going to do an agile study, let's, bite something we can chew, and let's look at what we can do with a limit on the territorial waters, something towards, what's the operating envelope. And then, so what's the actual precise fuel? We as the RHC don't get involved with the technical regulations. We look at the structure of how things are regulated today. We talked about, how this interaction between new technology and the regulators, how is that working? What can we see that's happening in other sectors, including, for example, with medicines or with medical devices, and just how have they approached things? How have they approached disruptive and novel, new technologies? And what can we learn? And I think we're looking at things from that framework. What I really hope is that the principles, the learnings, the findings from the report, they will apply to hydrogen-derived fuels in the ways of working. What can we do to speed things up? But even like tackling port infrastructure, that's still true, will be true for battery electric vessels as well. So I think the key point for us is let's look at the principles. We are too small and not domain experts to get involved in the chemistry.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of the time. I'm running out of questions here as well. I'm going to ask Ben, actually, this one. Many years ago in the MOD, when we were suffering quite badly from an influx of health and safety, I confessed to writing a little note to one civil servant to say, where does health and safety end and warfighting begin? And I think that's actually a reasonable question, and I've got a fairly sharp retort back. How do you see this fitting in with warfighting? If we have the capability to go machine learning and systems that work on it, would you switch some of them off when you went to war, or do you envisage that actually they'd just work?
That's a massive question. Rob, it's slightly unfair.
I haven't got time for a massive answer.
Yeah.
I'd like a one-liner.
I'm an interested amateur, and this is not an expert, but I've read it. I don't know if you saw a Sunday Times article about AI and a warfare this Sunday in the business section. Really, really good. Well, huge doom and gloom about robots taking over the world, and there's a thought answer about if you tell AI to go and make a load of paper clips, it will eventually come to humans and say, I need the iron in your blood, and therefore I'm going to kill off the human race. And it's this academic thought type process. I think it's a much simpler answer. We already have systems that can go fully automatic. And the Type 35, you go to C Viper Auto, if you have a huge air defense raid, you switch it to automatic, and you know the system can do it much more efficiently than the human can if you're having overwhelming air attack. So we already have the principles of doing that, taking the human out of the loop, and we don't really do that. And there's a much bigger ethical question about whether we should in the future. But I think we need to address that head on. But it's not a new question. That question's been posed many, many times. And how does health and safety feature into that? I mean,
Same thing.
yeah, safe to ourselves, lethal to our enemies, to pinch a first seed or two.
I'm going to wind this up now, unless there's any one last question. One last question from the floor, and then that's it. Who am I going to go to first? I think I'm going to... MCA, you've got your first opportunity to shout at this. Sorry.
There probably are examples, where you could say it would put us at a disadvantage, but I think if it's a quality product, it should be able to stand on its own 2 feet. If it needs us as a regulator to wrap it up in cotton wool to make it commercially viable, I think you need to question the quality of the product.
Thank you. Parag, do you want to have a go? And then
Yeah.
Andre.
Yes, just a comment.
Then we're going to wind up.
I think there is that approach, and you do see that sometimes, especially with setting of standards. And you see that whether it's a socket for an electric car or whatever it is. I think don't quote me on this, but I think in the UK we've got the approach of we don't pick winners, and we take a technology neutral approach and a level playing field. And I think, okay, you could say, well, that we're at a strategic disadvantage, but I think the other thing that we try, I think, in the UK to get right is to be open to all technologies and to be a good home for technology innovators and commercial developers. In terms of getting things right, to have robust and fair and reliable and evidence-based regulation. People who operate here and have developed towards with you. I mean, I've heard this directly, people saying the MCA is an asset. If it's regulated by the MCA, it's recognized as reliable around the world. So we get that kind of thing right. And I think this is my personal opinion, I think we try to attract technology and investment through just being first and good, rather than trying to pick the winners and then force our way through world markets.
Andre?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about autonomy more generally on this one as well a little bit. Firstly, I'm not sure, I wouldn't say it's a purist approach the MCA has, because I think they have shown, within the constraints they have to work, admirable efforts to be flexible and to listen. But I agree that I know that there have been people who've had issues with that. One of the things I find is I meet a lot of companies in the UK developing systems, and they're trying very hard to develop them well and safely. I also deal with a lot of entities from overseas and from certain countries where they put in sensors and things which aren't, and I can tell you now the specification is wrong, because we test these things to the point of a health and safety issue, these sensors, and it would make your skin crawl to think about having those systems all over the place without having properly tested. So I think that we're at a tipping point, and we're going to get there in how we do proper and effective and easy to access testing and assurance. We're not there yet, but if we don't have that, we have some huge risks facing us.
Yeah, Ben.
Can I just one devil's advocate point? I think it's a really, really fair question. We've got to keep challenging ourselves. We already saw when the first MSUBs went to certify the Mayflower, it's too difficult at MTA, so they did it in the States. That's not good enough. And I think the same high-profile case about floating battery technology company recently on the weekend, went to New York Stock Exchange instead of London. We've got to keep challenging ourselves, and there's lots of good reasons why it's difficult, I get that, but we've got to keep asking ourselves a question, otherwise we will lose out, I think.
Really good point. I'm going to finish there. All I would like to say, though, is I think this group and your companies have the potential to give us a unique selling point and to move this forward very quickly. All I would beg, I think, on behalf of the audience is don't take too long. So thank you very much for your presentations and also the very useful panel we've had here. But I'm going to wind it up there with the traditional way of saying thank you very much.